Good morning, friends, and welcome to Monday Morning Messages. I'm your host, Christine with a C. We are currently in a 6-part series called So Many Voices, which will run through the second Monday of January 2024. Today, we are on part 2, which is called Is God Calling You? If you missed part 1, check it out when you get a chance. You probably know that ministry is not an occupation that individuals choose, but rather God calls people to be ministers of the gospel, just like Jesus chose and specifically called 12 men to be his first disciples. But are full-time ministers the only people who are called by God? We will unpack that question on today's episode of Monday Morning Messages. In today's message, we will be looking at the calling of Samuel, found in the 3rd chapter of 1 Samuel. We'll read verses 1 through 11 and verse 19. So let's jump into the text. 1 Samuel chapter 3. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." So Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel a 3rd time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle." And then we're going to jump down to verse 19. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. So we see that God called Samuel, and he did not know God's voice yet. He was just a young boy. And to give this some context, before we jump into going over this text, most of you are probably familiar, but just to kind of bring us up to speed, if anyone is unfamiliar, Hannah and Elkanah were husband and wife, and Hannah longed to have a child and had not been able to, and so she was praying and asking God for a child. They went to the temple, and she asked God, and so God gave her that promise, and she said, "If you give me a son, I will give him back to you." And so God did give her a son. She named him Samuel. And then she, like she had promised, she took him and actually gave him to God. He lived at the temple with Eli. And so Eli, the priest, is older now. He has a couple grown sons that are doing wicked things. And so God is going to punish these wicked sons. And so this very first message that God gives Samuel is about what he's going to do because these sons are evil. But we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. So let's go back and jump into this text here. 1 Samuel chapter 3, the Lord calls Samuel. So during the day, the temple would have been bustling with people bringing sacrifices and coming to worship. However, after all the worshipers had gone home for the night, Samuel knew that Eli was the only other person there besides himself. In verse 2, we read that Eli's eyes were so weak that he could barely see. So he may have called Samuel for help during the night from time to time if he needed something. He couldn't see very well. It may have been a common occurrence for Eli to call out for young Samuel to come and bring him something or help him in some way. But verse 7 tells us that Samuel did not yet know the Lord. So the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. We know that he went on to become a prophet and gave many messages for God, but he did not know God's voice yet. So when he heard this voice, he would naturally assume that it was Eli calling him. So we're told that, Samuel went to Eli 3 times. He hears God calling his name. He doesn't know it's God. He runs to Eli. This happens 3 times before the elderly priest realized it was God, the Lord, who was calling the boy. And so I'm so thankful that God is willing to call us as many times as necessary for us to recognize that it's him. Then in verse 10, Samuel replied, "Speak, for your servant is listening." This is what Eli told him. So he hears God's voice again, and he says, "Speak, for your servant is listening." So the message God gave him was in regard to Eli's wicked sons, which I mentioned that. We won't get that in today's message, but you may want to go read it on your own. It was the part we skipped there between 11 and 19, 12 to 18 in other words. So it may have been difficult for Eli to hear that message that Samuel gave him, but according to verse 19, the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. This implies that Samuel was faithful to speak what God gave him, and each message from God he shared came true. A lot of people don't like to hear the message. A prophet would give something that wasn't always positive. And a lot of times there would even be prophets who would change it and say, "Oh, it's good news." But Samuel was faithful, even though it was hard for Eli to hear that his wicked sons would be punished, or for Israel to hear a lot of the messages that God gave. Samuel faithfully gave those messages from God as a prophet. He didn't change them or soften them to please the people. He was obedient to God as his faithful prophet. And so we know that Samuel, you probably know, Samuel went on to be greatly used by God as a prophet. In fact, he was the one that God sent to anoint the most well-known king in Israel's history, which was David. I didn't put down the reference for that, but you can find that if you're not familiar and you want to read that. It's in there as well. But what about you and me? Is God calling us? Does he only call certain people to full-time ministry, such as pastors or priests and missionaries? Or does he call everyone? 2 Corinthians 5:18 says that God reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That means that every individual who has been reconciled to God, saved, born again, has been called to share the gospel and help others be reconciled to him as well. Are you nervous to speak up for Jesus? Ask the Holy Spirit to help you. He will give you the courage you need, the right timing, and the words to speak to those who need to hear about him. And see Luke 12:12. So how else is God calling you and me? 1 Thessalonians 5:16 says, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances." In other words, he's calling us to live a life of joyful gratitude and prayer. There's something about a happy, thankful Christian that attracts lost people to Christ. So put a smile on, trust God to take care of you, and see what happens. That verse also says that God is calling you and me to pray without ceasing. Before you think, "I have a busy schedule, I don't have time to pray all day," think about this. Are you too busy with life to breathe? Of course not. You can't live without breathing. You do it all the time, right? So praying can become the same way for you. As you go through your day, just whisper prayers, thank God for his blessings, pray for your loved ones, ask him to help you with everything you do, ask him to open doors for you to share his love with others. In no time, praying without ceasing will become as naturally to you as breathing, and you'll be surprised at the difference it will make in your life. So is God calling you? He may not be calling you to a life of full-time ministry, or he may be. Either way, he is calling each of us to love and serve him by sharing his love with others. Are you listening? Thank you for taking the time to listen to this second message in our So Many Voices series. Feel free to share your thoughts with me, and if you enjoyed what you heard, please leave a like on this video. Please consider subscribing to my channel. You can leave a comment below and come back next week as we look at a story in chapter 10 of Luke's Gospel with the next Monday morning message in our So Many Voices series titled, Will You Have a Merry Christmas? See you then, and remember, faith in God gives us peace in our hearts. Shalom.